Uh, okay, so should we start, Carlos? Okay. Okay, so hello, everybody. Thanks a lot for connecting. We're very happy to have Adriana Piazza from the School of Business and Economics, Universidad de Chile, who will be talking about efficiency with political power dynamics and costly policy change. So we have, Adriana, 1 hour, questions in between. I will be reading the chat just in case that someone asks. So I will interrupt you if there are questions from the chat. So we have 1 hour. Thanks a lot for this talk. And okay, so the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks Juan for the presentation and for inviting me to present here. It's a pleasure to be virtually here, and well, I'm looking forward to meeting you all in person. I don't know when, but hopefully soon. So I will be presenting a joint work with Julia Raslan from Rice University and Osaka University. And it is a project that, in fact, we've been working in this for quite a long time already. And we hope to submit soon. And so any suggestions and comments are more than welcome, because it's the moment to do them. So let me start with a cartoon where we can see President Trump with what looks like the first constitution of the United States, and he's saying, just tell me which part Obama wrote, because I want to cut it out. And in fact, Trump is somehow famous for undoing a lot of things that were put into place by his predecessors. But actually, and in fact, it is very easy to find, if we look in the news, it is very easy to find headlines like this one, where it says Trump administration is reversing 100 environmental rules and things like that. But in fact, policy reversals are not unique to Trump administration. New presidents can and do reverse policies of their predecessors. And if we go a little bit further back into the headlines of the news, we can find a lot of examples, all of them in the context of environmental policies. But I mean, we choose some examples in the context of environmental policies, but actually you can find it in almost every other policy, right? And we see that Obama reversed Bush climate policies, Bush reversed Clinton policies on the environment, and Clinton as well eliminated the Council on Competitiveness put in place by George Father administration. And this kind of presidential ping pong is not exclusive of the US, neither of environmental regulations. And it's very easy to think about close examples. Think, for example, in the successive tax reforms that we have suffered in Chile in the last decade, or the educational reforms and things like that. So when there are changes in preferences or in technology, it is natural to expect policy reversal. But in fact, we can find a lot of policy reversals when the underlying economy remains pretty much the same. So what we want to do in this paper is to build a dynamic political economy model with stable primitives and show when policy reversals arise. Right? And we're going to show that they occur mostly due to political turnover. And we are going to show that they are inefficient in the Pareto sense. And more than that, we're going to show that these policy reversals are the norm. They are not an exception. They are the norm if the costs of policy changes are sufficiently small. Right? So in our model, we have two political parties, left
Adriana?
and right. Yes.
Adriana, can I make a question? There are Trump cannot change things around in the law unless he gets the Congress to approve. What he can do is do something called directives or something like that, which the president can order without going through Congress, and those can be reversed easily. And they're used a lot for measures like some environmental measures, etc. But the other ones require also a change in Congress to have some sort of majority in Congress too. So do you separate the two, or do you consider them all the same? How do you distinguish between them?
Yeah. In the main part of the paper, we consider that the decisions are taken unilaterally. They are taken by a strong government, like the president and the Congress. The Congress have the majority. The majority of the Congress is of the same political party than the president. At the end, we have an extension where we have sometimes a strong government, sometimes weak government. And in fact, we've seen that more than 50% of the times, at least in the US, the party in power in the government has the majority of at least one of the chambers of the Congress of the United States.
Yeah, but that's not sufficient to pass a law. You need the two houses.
Yeah. So mainly we consider only strong government. So the decisions are taken unilaterally. And at the end, we have a brief generalization. Yeah.
Good.
Thank you.
Adriana?
Yes.
Why is puzzling that you see these changes in policy? Why is puzzling? What here? I mean, if you just see changing political parties that are ruling, and then they change their policy, so I don't see why this is particularly puzzling. And I'm missing something. I'm totally an outsider in political economy, so you can school me.
Yeah, well, it is somehow puzzling because changing policy is costly, right? So we are going to show that when there are this continued back and forth in the policy, both parties are worse off than just, agreeing in a middle ground policy. And which is somehow even, well, I don't know if it is too puzzling, but it's something that we found interesting. And what I found a little bit more interesting is that when costs increase, everybody is better off than when costs decrease.
So it's not about, I mean, because you can go further and you can see, well, it's puzzling that the American voters go for Obama and 4 years after they go for Trump, right? So it's something that is is the voter decision that is puzzling, or is the political system that allows this sort of polarization? So I'm sort of lost. It's something about the institutions, or it's about the voters and the political process?
Yeah. Okay, thank you for the question. It is about the decisions that the political parties are taking. We are not modeling voters. For us, the probability of staying in power is constant and exogenously given. It does not depend on the voter. We can found this decision, this modeling decision, thinking that we are studying what happens in one policy, and there are a lot more other policies that the voters will take into account to decide what to do at the election. So the probability of remaining in power is completely independent of the decisions that the political party is taking with respect to this particular policy. Okay. Okay, so as I said, There is political turnover. The party in power changes randomly, but this probability of change is exogenously given, it's fixed and given. Right? Parties have different ideal policies. A new government would like to get into power and immediately put in place its ideal policy, but it will not do that because changing policy is costly. So it will maybe introduce a modification on the policy, but will not go right away to the ideal policy. And we also add this feature that this cost of changing the policy is not shared equally between the two parties. The party in power could use its power to pay a lot less than what's fair of this change in policy cost. Okay, and this is what we call favor.
Just understand, when you say that this political how you call it, turnover, no, these political changes are inefficient, but you don't have voters. How how do you measure efficiency?
I'm considering the total payoff of both political parties.
Of both, yeah. So you're ignoring voters. I see. And okay, I understand.
Yeah, I'm ignoring. Yeah. So these are our main results. A sequence of policies cannot involve any policy reversals if there is going to be any hope of this sequence of policies being Pareto efficient. So if at time zero, given the status quo, I modify the policy a little bit to the right, if I want to keep in an efficient policy, then I can only modify this policy to the right in the whole future. If I reverse and go a little bit to the left, I'm doomed. I mean, this is not going to be efficient. When polarization is high, this is ideological polarization. Both parties have very different ideal policies. We can prove, yeah.
But I would say that, you know, the reason that you have a change is because voters want the change. So somehow, you know what I mean? I mean, the reason that we elect Obama is because we want this policy. So somehow in the first best, there should be like some policy reversals. You know what I mean? In terms, I mean, if I think about voters or not.
Yeah, I understand that what we are thinking here is this work at the beginning was inspired in environmental policies. And we think voters who do not decide their vote exclusively depending on environmental policies, but they decide in a whole other range of things. Mainly
okay, I understand. Yeah.
Probably.
I guess they put some weight, but not food. That's not the only determinant of their decisions, right? I guess. Yeah. I see.
Yeah. I will come back to that briefly in a few slides. Okay, so we proved that when this ideological polarization is high, there is an equilibrium. The equilibrium is unique and it's not efficient because there are perpetual policy reversals. When polarization is low, but favoritism is high, this is partisan favoritism, meaning partisan favoritism high means that the party in power pays very little share of the total cost of modifying policies. Then we have a totally different situation. We have a continuum of equilibria, and some of them may be inefficient, but there are always some efficient equilibria. And when neither polarization nor favoritism is high, well, I will not talk about this at all in the presentation today, but we can, in the paper, we have completely characterized the equilibrium that arises. Sometimes we have a unique equilibrium, sometimes we have multiple equilibria, and all this is in the paper. And I want to mention that these equilibrium or equilibria are always efficient, at least in the long run. And by long run, I mean after the first political turnover, the first change in government. Right? So when the cost of policy change is sufficiently small, then we see that it's good to increase the cost. We will always be better, well, not always, I'm sorry, if the cost of policy change is small and I am starting from a status quo that is moderate, not very extreme, then both parties are better off by increasing a little bit the cost of policy change. Right? Favoritism, on the other hand, is always bad. An increase in favoritism reduces welfare. And methodologically, our contribution comes because we use shape refinement to choose between potentially a lot of stationary Markov perfect equilibria that appear in our game. So we are going to consider only some particular equilibrium that have a particular shape on the strategy. And we show that by doing that, we still have equilibrium and we are capable of characterizing all of them. So this is some of the papers related to our paper. And I want to mention this one. This is a working paper by Gerbash, Jackson, Mueller, and Tejada. They do have voters. They have a similar model, very similar to ours, but in some senses it is more general. They do have voters. And as they are, modeling the election, it turns out that the results they get, they're almost the same that we get. So there is not that much of an improvement by adding voters in this model. We have a big difference in the first step, but after the first change in government, in the long run, we have exactly the same type of equilibrium. Okay, so this is the model. As I said, we have two parties, left and right, that take decisions unilaterally. Adjusting the policy by an amount W cost CW, and we are considering only linear costs. And as I said before, the incumbent and the opponent may pay a different share of the cost. Right? Both parties discount the future at the same discount factor. Right? Very good. I think I've already mentioned all that. We are going to denote by kappa to the party in power. This party will unilaterally decide the policy, and the probability that the incumbent remains in power is exogenously given and equal to P. Before going into the solution of the game, I want to mention a couple of benchmarks. The first one is to start by characterizing the optimal policy sequence when there is one political party in power in every period. Of course, this is a optimization problem, singulation problem, and we get a solution like that. This is the policy that the dictator is going to put in place depends on the status quo and is given by this policy function. Right? When the status quo is too much on the left, the dictator will move it to the right up to this point. This is what we define as the minimum acceptable policy for party I. And I will, in a minute, give you the exact equation that characterizes this threshold. If the status quo is too much on the right, then the dictator will move it to this maximum acceptable policy, move it to the left, right, to X bar I. And in between, the policy remains unchanged. So in this very simple model, we have only one adjustment of the policy, if we have either 0 or 1 adjustment. If we are very much to the left, we are moving it to the right up until this point, and then we remain there forever. Right? same thing to the.
So, sorry, how are the stage payoffs in the game? Sorry, I mean.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I went too fast in here. This is the stage payoff, right? I have a benefit function that depends exclusively on the policy that I am putting in place now. This is the decision that the political party is taking, X prime, and a cost that depends on how much I modify the status quo. X is the status quo, X prime is my decision. Sorry about that.
But the assumption is that for one of the players, UI is increasing and the other decreasing. What's the assumption on UI?
There's one dictator.
No.
There's a dictator.
Yeah.
Dictator.
Yeah, but
this is dictator. Yeah, both political parties have strictly concave benefit functions that are smooth, and we have this. I'm sorry, I went too fast here. We have this. This is how we compare the utility that the party L gets with the utility party R.
Yeah, that I understand.
Yes.
Okay.
Adriana, because of the linear cost, it's always it's not like you wanted to. You always want to make it smooth, but I mean, if it were convex or concave, you were, preferring to defer over time different changes, right?
Yes, exactly. Because of the linear cost, we make the adjustment at once. We are not interested in doing very, smaller steps until reaching this point.
Right. Right. But I mean, well, we can discuss later, but if you only have 4 years, you want to do everything in a hurry before the next election, right?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. And also the fact that the costs are linear, because if I was going to, make a graph of the cost is like this, right? And the fact that we have a non-differentiability here it's what makes that I have this whole range of, in this segment, I'm not changing the policy at all. And this comes because if this was smooth here, then I will go maybe slowly, asymptotically, I would converge to the optimal point, the ideal point. But I don't do that because of the linear structure of the cost. Right? So imagine my UI is just a quadratic, and so this is the derivative is linear, and I can easily find the minimum acceptable policy and the maximum acceptable policy. The minimum acceptable policy is such that the marginal benefit of the dictator from moving the policy to the right by an additional unit, all the marginal benefits I'm getting from here to the infinity, I'll say that, discounted back to today, these are equal to the unitary cost of modifying the policy. And like this, I can find these two thresholds that I am interested in. And we can see things like if the cost decreases, this level will go to 0, and this minimum acceptable policy will move to the right until it reaches x hat being the ideal policy. So if there are no costs, I will always go to the ideal policy. This one here, this is my range of policies that I do not change, I do not modify. And this range that I much better do it here. This is the range, okay? So if the costs decrease, this range becomes smaller, and in the end, it collapses to only one point. Okay. So this is simple. The other benchmark I want to discuss today is the Pareto efficient. For us, a Pareto allocation is a sequence of functions that is telling me at every time stage which is the policy I must put in place given the initial policy and also given the sequence of identities of the parties that have been in power. And we can prove this result that Pareto efficient allocations do not have policy reversals. If we want this sequence to be Pareto efficient, then no matter which is the sequence of political parties in the government, no matter which is the identity or which has been the identity of the government in the whole history, I always move the policy in the same direction, if I move it at all, right? There cannot be any policy reversal. Either I go always to the right or always to the left. And then we also study what happens when the policies are always constant. What happens if I leave my policy always constant? Is it going to be efficient? Yes or no? The result is not surprising at all. There is one interval of policies where if I remain there forever, then this sequence of policy is going to be efficient, right? And this segment of policies we can characterize very easily, very precisely. This is the minimum acceptable policy for party L when L is the dictator. This is the maximum acceptable policy for party R when R is the dictator. And anything in between, if I am there and remain there forever, then this is going to be a constant sequence of policy, an efficient sequence of policy, right? And in this case, this segment may be perhaps small because I am graphing the policy, the optimal policy when L is the dictator, and in red I have the optimal policy when R is the dictator. And we see they're not very different because they overlap in a pretty big segment, right? So in here, maybe it is not that surprising that all here, everything that is in green here is efficient, but also in the situation on the right, when they both have like very different optimal policy functions when R is the dictator and when L is the dictator. In that case, too, everything in between is also efficient. Okay, this is given mostly by the fact that both benefit functions are concave. And we have then another range, this orange range, where if we are going to remain there forever, constant policies, then we are for sure in an inefficient sequence of policies. There is a gray area here where we were not able to tell if remaining there forever is always efficient or always inefficient, but we have, yes, at least partially characterized the efficiency of the constant policy allocations. So now I'm going to finally describe the equilibrium. And we are going to focus on stationary Markov strategies that where the payoff depend only on the policy that's been put in place. And yeah. So sigma I is the policy, right? This is the decision party I is going to make when party I is in power if the status quo is X. Say party I gets into power, looks at the status quo and see this is, okay, my present level of the policy is X, and decides to implement sigma I of X. This is how it works. This is the equations that the equilibrium, these are the equations that the equilibrium must fulfill. So an equilibrium is actually a set of 6 functions, 2 strategy profiles for player L and player R, and 4 value functions. 2 value functions for L and 2 for party R. BL is going to be the value function of left when left is in power. And W is the value function for L when right is in power. Here, the same. VR is the value function for party R when right is in power, and this one is, well, value function for party R when left is in power. So the optimal policy must belong to the solution of this problem. Given the status quo X, if party I decides to implement the policy X prime, this is the cost party I, but it's in power now, have to pay. This is the benefit that party I will get from implementing X prime. And this is the continuation value. This factor, P, the probability of staying in power, plus value function when I is in power, and probability of becoming the opponent plus times value function of when I is the opponent and the status quo is X prime, right? And these value functions, B and W, must be given by these functional equations over here, right? If I is in power, I is taking the decisions, so in here I put sigma I of X, right? And when I is out of power, J is taking the decisions, so I'm using here sigma J of X. That's the difference between V and W. Okay. So it's not easy to work with this. It's not easy to prove uniqueness in here, in this big set of system, of equations. So we are going to restrict attention to a very particular class of stationary Markov perfect equilibrium. And this is the class where...
Adriana?
Yes.
Before you go, this idea that my probability of reelection is independent of the policies, it's a standard assumption here, because I will, as an outsider, I will think that the more, I mean, probability of re-election depends on my policies. It's something that if I deliver the policies I promised during the campaign, my re-election probability will be higher. Why here this P has nothing to do with X?
Yeah. Well, as I said before, if we are going to open this possibility of having the probability of staying in power depending on X, then there is a whole new literature that opens, and there are a lot of things on there, right? And it depends on what the voter is going to consider at the time of voting. Is it what the political party is promising to do in the future? Is it what the political party did if it is the incumbent? I mean, this is a very valid question, and there are a lot of things to say about that. And but there is some maybe smaller literature where P is taken exogenously given, and more prominence is given to the fact that we are introducing costs. And so this is like the main thing we want to study here. What is the effect of the cost on the equilibrium? But yes, but you are right. I mean, this is a very valid point. Okay. Well, as I said, we are going to, as I was saying, we are going to restrict attention only to equilibrium where the strategy is given by this equation here. And let me put a graph, it's much better. This is the type of strategies we are going to be considering, right? We have two reasons for that. One of them is that when we solved the dictator problem, this was the structure of the optimal policy of the dictator. And we want the dictator to be, I mean, we want the solution of the dictator to be one possibility of the Markov, of the equilibrium we are going to look for. So this type of structures should be, right? And also because when we solve the finite horizon problem, all we get are these type of policy functions. So we said, okay, let's restrict our attention to this type of policy functions and nothing else, right? Well, nothing else. We also consider this type, okay? This is a particular case of this structure. This we call the S-shaped structure. And when the two thresholds over here collapse into one point, we get a constant policy function. And it may seem a little bit surprising, but we are getting equilibrium with these constant strategies, right? So there may be others with more complicated strategies. We are not dealing with them. We're only dealing with these two types of strategies, right? So in here in the panel on the left, I put the graphs of the dictator strategies for party L and party R. And I assume that in this case, they're not collapsing. Here there is a large polarization. What R is doing, if it's going to be the dictator, it's completely different of what left would do if left was a dictator, right? So if, let's imagine the status quo is over here, very much to the left, and I am right, and I am the dictator, I'm going to jump all the way up to here, right? And I'm going to implement X underbar R. This is my minimum acceptable policy. But then I know I'm not the dictator. I know that eventually I will lose power and left will come into power. And left will for sure, if I am here, left will for sure move the policy to the left, and I'm going to lose my investment forever, for good. So I'm going to behave strategically. And I'm going to say, well, instead of jumping all the way up to this point, I will stop a little bit earlier, before. Well, I change this threshold and I go only to this point, X. And this point over here is what we call the minimum, the moderated minimum acceptable level for R. Okay. The thing is that X, this minimum acceptable level for R, moderated, can be found exogenously by using all the parameters of the model. It's very easy to find it. I'm going to show you in a minute the equation. And this maximum moderated acceptable level for L, that is the analogous, right? L is the dictator, the status quo is very much to the right. If L was the dictator, it's going to change it all the way to this point, but then behaves strategically, and it goes only to this point, moderated maximum acceptable level for R. We can compute these two before solving the game. It's very easy. And they're closer together. And in fact, they could, cross each other and go all the way to the other part. This is possible, right? Or not. What we say is we are going to compute them. We can compute it before solving the game. And if this is the case, that they are not crossing each other, they are still the moderated maximum acceptable level for L is to the left of the minimum moderated acceptable level for R, then we define this as high polarization. This is our definition, right? So in here is the equation that is going to give me the moderated maximum acceptable level for R and the moderated minimum acceptable level for R. Sorry, this is L, this is R. I compute them, and if it happens that this value is to the left of this value, I'm saying I am in the high polarization case. And if this is, yeah.
But the way in which we should understand these two numbers is like best replies, right?
Yes.
Given the moderate that the right guy is doing, I want to like moderate myself a bit, right?
Yes.
And reduce, right? That's like the two equations that nail down this, right? That's the way we should think about it. Like two best replies, right?
Yes, two best replies. Yes, exactly. Yeah. But the thing is, a priori, I'm using, when I compute this point, I'm using the fact that when I lose power, right is going to move the policy to the right. Right? And this is not always the case, because it could happen that these two thresholds here cross each other, and then there is the solution is completely different of the one I'm going to show you now. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So in the hyperpolarization case, I'm sorry, the hyperpolarization case is in here. This is what we define. Oh, sorry about that. We refer to the case where this value is to the left of these other ones. These two can be computed exogenously before solving the game. And if this happens, then we define our game to be in the high polarization case. And in that case, these are the strategy, the equilibrium strategy that both players are playing. All right? And this point here, the maximum policy that party left is going to implement is exactly the threshold we just defined. And this value here, the minimum policy that right will implement, it's willing to implement, it's exactly this point over here, the ones I just described, right? So we know, if this is the solution, we know a lot of things. We know that parties always reverse each other's policies. Every time there is a change in government, there is a change in the policy. And we also know that then the equilibrium is inefficient, because I have continuous perpetual policy reversal. If these parties would agree on a point over here, both of them would be better. But they keep going back and forth. The equilibrium is unique. I don't have a lot of time, but let me talk a little bit about what happens with these points here, right? Imagine that I am now party L, and this is the status quo. What am I going to do? If I'm party L, this is the status quo, and I was a dictator, I would go all the way up to here, and this point here will be the one we already compute when solving the dictator problem, the minimum acceptable policy for a dictator. Right? What happens if I'm not the dictator? Where am I going to go? Right? The thing is, if I'm not the dictator, and the cost of adjusting the policy is, shared equally by me and by the opponent, I will go exactly to the same place. This part of the strategy function in the equilibrium, it is exactly equal to the dictator policy function. If I pay half of the cost of modifying the policies and the opponent pay the other half. But if the political system is such that I can, give to the opponent, throw to the opponent a lot more costs than the one I'm going to pay. I do not share the pay equally, but I'm always paying, I don't know, instead of 50% of the cost, 30% of the cost, and the opponent is going to pay 70. And I know that when I lose power, the opponent is going to change the policy to the right, and it's going to make me pay 70% instead of 50. In that case, I do not go here. I go further. Oh, sorry. I go more to the right, further down the line. We call this here the precautionary minimum acceptable level. I'm being precautious because I know, due to favoritism, that, well, it is better to implement myself the change and pay a reduced cost than wait for the opponent to implement it and make me pay a bigger share. Even though if I'm totally happy here, actually, but I am going to go further back, furthermore.
Adriana?
Yeah.
So favoritism then is how much I can throw of the cost on the other side, on the other guy.
Yeah, that's it. Okay, so we can again characterize these two new thresholds with, they all depend on the parameters of the model. It is possible to compute them quite easily, right? I mean, these are the equations, but I don't know. Just to show, I put the equations here just to show you that it is very easy to compute them once you know the parameters, right? And so when this gamma is the share of the cost that the party in power is going to pay, if gamma is equal to 0.5, then there is no favoritism. But when it's less than 0.5, we see that the opponent is going to pay more than the incumbent, and we say there is favoritism. And when this balance is less equal, less fair, when C prime increases and C decreases, we see that these thresholds move this minimum acceptable precautionary minimum acceptable policy will move more to the right, and this maximum will move more to the left, right? And it may happen that they cross each other again. It may happen. If we are in the high favoritism case, when this is the solution, then it never happens, because we know that these two, right? We know that this moderated threshold is to the left and this minimum moderated threshold for party right. And we also can prove using the definition that this is true. Right? We can prove that this minimum precautionary policy will never go to the right of this one for party L. And same thing with here happens here. So if I am in the high favoritism, in the high polarization case, favoritism doesn't change much my solution. I will only see that this goes a little bit more up and this will go down, but I will have always more or less the same graph here. The picture is more or less the same. But if I am not in the high polarization case, it may happen when the costs are very different and I'm making the opponent pay for everything, for almost everything of the cost of moving the policies. It may happen that this one goes to the right of this one. And when this happens, we say we are in the case where the favoritism is high, right? And when favoritism is high, then the solution, it's more weird, if you want. The solution is going to be constant. No matter what is the status quo, both parties will always implement the same policy, alpha. But this policy alpha is not unique. Every policy in between these two values is an equilibrium strategy. Right? These two values are this one over here, right? And remember that they now are like this. And I know that XPR is less than XPL. And everything, every level, every policy in between these two can be a solution to my problem, right? In this case, we have multiple equilibria, right? Because everything in this segment is equilibrium strategy. And so now, in this segment, I always have efficient solutions, always, right? I can always find an alpha in here such that if my policy remains constant in this point, at a point in here, it's when this segment is large, it may also happen that I have inefficient levels of alpha, right? So when I have high favoritism, I don't have a unique equilibrium. I might have inefficient equilibria due to lack of coordination, if you want, but there are always efficient equilibria. So with this, I want to finish, right? We can, in some sense, classify our solutions to the game in three cases. One, when I have high polarization, I know there is a unique solution, and this unique solution is inefficient because I have perpetual policy reversal. Right? When I have low polarization, then, well, I have to divide the cases into two. When I have high favoritism, then the solutions are constant and might be inefficient or not. I always have some efficient solutions, but I could have also inefficient equilibrium. And when both are low, and I didn't describe this at all, then we have solutions that may or may not be unique, but that they are always efficient, at least in the long run. And I think I'm going to stop here because I think I've run out of time.
One of the things that, may I, Juan, do we wanted to say something?
No, go ahead, please.
One of the things that I found a bit is something that Carlos also noticed, that, but I won't put in the same terms, which is that P is independent of everything. It's just, but it would seem to me that when a party takes a very extreme position, then there's what one observes is that because of the vote is not decided by the party itself, but by the undecided that move from one side to the other. Usually one thinks is that there are committed people that don't change, and then there's a group of people in the middle that move from one side to the other, depending on policies. And when things are very extreme, those guys tend to switch to the other side. So the P wouldn't be independent of past, of how left or right you went. Have you thought about that? The probability of re-election, I mean.
Yeah, I know. We would love to work with a P dependent on X. And technically, the problem comes when we want to prove uniqueness. I mean, we can find solutions. We can find some equilibrium, but we are completely lost when it comes to show that everything we found is the only thing we have. Because of course, I didn't have time to speak about how we prove uniqueness, but we have to work a lot with all these thresholds that appear. And we have several cases when this threshold is to the right of the other one and things like that. And we are, I'm sorry, I'm mumbling now, but we are using very strongly that P is always constant. Because if P changes, then we have like an exponential number of cases and we couldn't just work with that. That's the problem.
I have a similar comment in the same way, but like I will comment putting it differently, that okay, this doesn't look like a model of like a democratic country or a country with elections, because then clearly parties determine their policies depending on their possibility of being elected and what voters think influence. And like when I think of this as if, if it's a country where the government changes not with elections, but with coups. Like, one general comes and makes a coup, and then another general comes and makes a coup. And so the direction is stochastically determined by an outside process which has nothing to do with the decision. And I couldn't come up with some other example of that. So, I mean, of course, I understand why you want to write a story about policy removal of political parties, but this doesn't look like a political system at all.
Okay.
Yeah, but I have 2 comments. I mean, I guess that even if you think about the general who is like, I mean, like exogenously coming, like in a military coup, even in that case, that should depend also like on policies, right? I mean, when the current party, right, is doing like crazy things, like you have the other general coming. But I guess that, so that's one comment. And the other comment is that, but I guess that it could still be like the same basic insights arise, right? I mean, somehow what you need is that the parties are a bit more extremes than the median voter. I mean, that's right. I mean, you're assuming like a very like stark, in a very stark way, like how moderate the voters are somehow, right? So I guess what like the basic tension should be something like about the comparison between like how moderate the voters are compared to the parties, right? The parties should be like a bit more extreme in the sense that they want like more extreme positions, or I guess, right?
Okay, yeah, I see a way of modeling the voter without too much complexity.
I guess I just try to think whether like doing like endogenous, like having like some voters would actually like go in opposite direction to what you have. That's what I'm trying to think, right? And yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I see. Well, what I mentioned, this paper, Jackson and all paper in here. They do have voters in here, right? They have a very similar model. The main difference is they work all the time with quadratic. Actually, these 2 works, they work and ours is independent, but pretty much we did them pretty much at the same time. And just now this year, we learned about this working paper. The difference are that we are working with any U, the benefit function U for us is just concave. They work only with quadratic. They are working in a very small segment, 0, 1, and we work in the whole line. And this actually, our case is easier because they are all the time dealing with corner solutions, right? If I'm in 0 and 1, and that makes the whole analysis a lot more complicated. They do not have favoritism, but they do have election. But the way they are putting this is like the voter is going to, in the end, it boils down that the voter will keep re-electing the incumbent, because if the voter elected the incumbent once, it's happy with keeping re-electing the same political party, as long as the voter does not learn that the political party is not good at the government, right? So I elect, I don't know, the voter elects Party L, and we'll keep electing Party L as long as Party L is doing a good job in the government. And this good job or bad job, it's actually an exogenous shock. So at the end, except for the first election where really our model is really different, then it's always the same, because the probability of staying in power is an exogenous fixed shock. And so this is the only working paper that I know where we have costs of policy changes and elections. And maybe more.
Or is there any are there like more questions or comments? Okay, so I think we're done. Thanks a lot, Adriana, for your talk, and thanks everyone for connecting. Yeah, so there is a question in the chat whether the paper is available, Adriana. I guess it is.
I think no. I think it's not. We don't have it like uploaded in any.
I see. I see. So not yet for the question in the chat. Okay. Okay. Well. Thanks a lot. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity and all the comments. It means a lot to us. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great. Bye bye.